Can it be contained? The World Health Organization's Emergency Committee meeting for the third time in under 2 weeks. The coronavirus continuing to spread globally. The UN agency stating it's not nearly as deadly as the 2003 SARS epidemic that killed nearly 800. But the WHO boss also apologizing for minimizing the risk at the outset. Should it have been declared a global emergency sooner? Was there political pressure on the part of China, with airlines suspending flights and foreign countries organizing airlifts of their citizens? The stakes are immense. We'll evaluate the real dangers, and as the country scrambles, putting its epicenter Wuhan under quarantine, we'll assess crisis management in a China where decision-making is more than ever top-down and where a tighter-than-ever control on information can prove a double-edged sword in this kind of situation when authorities are trying to prevent panic. We'll ask about China's persistent image abroad, its image problem abroad, and the backlash against that backlash here in France, with Asians, not just those of Chinese origin, speaking out against the casual, everyday racism they've been subjected to since the outbreak of this current crisis. Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking how to contain the coronavirus outbreak. And joining us from London is Richard Horton, editor of the science journal The Lancet. Thank you for being with us.
Pleasure.
China consultant Jean-Paul Chang is with us as well. Welcome back to the show. André Lezecoq-Petry, political commentator, founder of A Capital.
Good evening.
Nice to see you. And France 24's very own Julia Kim.
Hi, Francois.
How are you?
Good, thank you.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter. The hashtag is F24debate. Yeah, after asking how you keep a city of 11 million under quarantine, here's a new one for you. How do you keep a 4,250-kilometer border shut?
Today, we're informing everyone about measures taken to close the border with China. We have to do everything to protect our people.
Mongolia already made such an announcement. Jean-Paul Chang, how's it going to go, the Russians closing the border with China?
In not delivering visas, for instance, because the Chinese citizens need visas to go to Russia. And it's actually you have some points on the Chinese-Russian border in the Manchuria, along the Heilongjiang River, Khabarovsk, Manzhouli. That's the main key points where the Chinese citizens just trade with the other side, and so it's quite easy to stop this.
Stop the trade?
Stop the contract, the contact, and people crossing the border. It's not a big deal, actually.
Why is it not a big deal?
Because it's a limited point of border opening between China and Russia in the northeast of China border. So it's not so,
Are the Russians overreacting?
No. I mean, it's a precaution, but it's not a big deal because along these 4,000 kilometers, you have a lot of places where there's no life, no habitants, and no traffic. So the main traffic is between the Chinese Manchuria and the east part of Siberia. So and that's a limited number of point of border checking. So Manzhouli, Khabarovsk on the eastern side, and it's quite easy to say, okay, we just stop. The buses are not passing through the bridge. The train are stopped, and not bringing the passenger in. And I imagine that it's not an impossible thing.
All right, and then a lot of the news coverage this Thursday has been over what is a sensible precaution and what is overreaction. A long way from the Russian border, the Italian port of Civitavecchia, north of Rome. 6,000 passengers aboard the Costa Smeralda were screened after a 54-year-old woman from Macau came down with flu-like symptoms. She and her partner put under isolation, and they now appear to have tested negative. Be it in Italy or here in France, is it fear that's contagious?
We get some ridiculous questions, like I walked past a Chinese-looking person in the street and he coughed near me. Should I be worried? Let's say we receive about 100 calls a day about the coronavirus. Only about 10% of them lead to actual medical tests.
Richard Horton, your reaction to what the head of the Paris paramedics says there?
Well, I'm very sympathetic to the anxiety that people feel. You've got an epidemic that is literally overwhelming China. Every single province in China is now affected with cases of coronavirus infection, and it is now seeding itself around the world. So it's understandable that people are anxious, but that's why it's so important that we have very good and really quite assertive public information to make sure that people understand that this is an acute respiratory tract infection that is moderately transmissible, but which is has a very low, as far as we can tell, a very low risk of severe complications. So I think we need to be much better at our public information, and it's the lack of public information, not only in China but also in other countries, that is fueling this public anxiety.
So are the measures that have been taken overreaction, like suspending flights, like closing borders?
So I think the reaction in China of isolating cities, and it's not just Wuhan, there's another 14 cities in Hubei province. They've basically locked down an entire province of up to 50 million people. Those responses are the right responses if you want to extinguish an epidemic. So that's a good thing to do. The part that's going wrong is that there is a lot of misinformation that is out there, and not enough information is being given to the public about the risks and the dangers and what they should do. And that's what can then fuel not only anxiety, but actually civil unrest. And that's my concern, that the Chinese authorities need to do a much better job of empowering their local public health leaders to talk to the public. Our information is that people have been told that they're not allowed to speak to the media, they're not allowed to speak to the public. And in that vacuum, that's where you will get problems.
So what is the misinformation that we're getting? So that's lack of information you're describing. What's the misinformation, and who's giving out this misinformation?
Well, there's a lot of fake news that's now beginning to circulate. I'll give you some examples. There's what's the origin of this virus? Is one question. Was it the seafood market in Wuhan? There's a rumor that's circulating that somehow it might be a bioweapon in a biosafety level 4 laboratory in Wuhan that had some connection to the United States. There's absolutely no evidence to support that whatsoever, but those are the kind of rumors that are spreading because there's not enough information that's being put out there by the Chinese authorities. And that is just going to scare people even more. And that then leads to them wanting to escape Wuhan, whereas actually what you need is that they stay in their homes, there's no public gatherings, and you have social distancing. And if you don't have good information, people are going to do exactly the opposite of what's necessary.
André Luzacu-Petri, that's what the reporters that are on the ground are saying, that people locally in Wuhan are pleased with the way authorities are handling the crisis. They accept perfectly well the concept of the lockdown, but it is true that there is frustration over the lack of information.
I mean, I think this crisis, is dramatic, but it's also really symbolic. It's a bit the test of the systems. Can a top-down system like China is be efficient, because it's all about efficiency, in handling of this crisis? And indeed, I mean, in no other part of the world would we have been able to lock down 50 million people in quarantine, as Mr. Horton said. Then on the other side, do we want to accept that? This is almost a moral principle. Then on the information, I understand that the lack of information is probably the critical thing where the Chinese have been extremely poor on. But on the other side, let's not forget, this is an unfolding story. It's not clear yet whether people are, for example, contagious before they have symptoms or not. So this lack of uncertainty makes it actually difficult for anybody to actually comment on it. We indeed, the transparency is important to avoid these fake news like the one which was. But on the other side, being very assertive about the type of transmission, when are you contagious, what should be done. I think we are really seeing these 21st century crises which are combining globality. I mean, it's a global crisis. Speed. I mean, it's a speed we have never seen before. In just 3 weeks, this has spread all over. And third, this dilemma for political leaders is, do they need to be over precautious? And then they lock down the whole country with the risk of also creating a lot of anxiety. And those, like, for example, the French Minister of Health or the head of WHO, who now needs to apologize, who at the beginning said, well, actually, the mortality is much lower than SARS was. So it's not that acute of crisis.
There was that front page headline in Le Monde Wednesday evening, the French daily newspaper, which quoted unnamed sources at the WHO saying China had pressured the World Health Organization into minimizing the risk.
Well, the challenge here is that the WHO had already a track record. Remember the Ebola crisis, where part of their understating of the importance was responsible for the initial outbreak. And it probably, with a tougher response of WHO, this outbreak of the Ebola virus could have been contained much earlier. And as you remember, it was extremely deadly. I mean, it's a real dilemma, because either you go in a society where as soon as there's a little risk, you lock down everything, the famous principe de précaution in French, or you have some kind of acceptable risk, because at the end of the day, if there is risk, we will end up in a society where nothing is possible anymore.
2003, the SARS outbreak, there were nearly 800 killed, much deadlier if you look at the statistics. Of course, in those days, the Chinese didn't travel the way they do today, and you didn't have the internet.
Exactly. And so now what we're seeing here in France, especially from the cases that I've been looking at online, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence. A lot of Chinese people and a lot of French people of Asian origin, not necessarily Chinese, being mistaken for Chinese people, Chinese tourists, who are suspected of carrying this virus. And, from what we know so far, only 5 cases exist at the moment in the country. They've all been contained. And yet there is this kind of cloud of suspicion over all Asian people in this country. And we're seeing it in the metro, we're seeing it in shops, on the street. Day-to-day interactions are now colored by this kind of fear that people have. And it does boil down to a lack of information. We don't really know exactly what the symptoms are. People are saying that the first week it takes about 7 to 12 days to incubate, that it's asymptomatic, but we haven't had any confirmation about this. So as a result, people are drawing their own conclusions and trying to keep safe by avoiding and, frankly, discriminating.
Is that anybody's fault? It's just too early to tell.
I mean, I guess so. But then at the same time, it really does. People have pointed out that it's kind of uncovered this underlying racism, anti-Asian racism in France. That's not very publicized. That's almost minimized compared to racism, towards Jewish people or racism towards Muslim people in society. So minorities that are much more prominent in this country.
If I may say, I saw one of the titles in your initial story on the Courrier Picard was titling.
Yeah, it's a local newspaper, regional
Alerte
newspaper.
jaune.
Exactly.
I think
The
this
yellow
is
alert.
outrageous.
And
I'm for liberty of the press, but this is really, for me, blatant racism.
They had another headline, which was Nouveau Péril Jaune,
Exactly.
new yellow peril. I mean, this is the kind of language that we saw.
It was 80 years ago.
Exactly. Decades ago, the post-colonial era. How could they be bringing that back to describe this epidemic? It's very irresponsible.
Richard Horton, what's the coverage been like where you are?
In the United Kingdom, there is a great deal of anxiety that's present, but I don't think we've seen any of what you've just described as racism against people from China or from the Asian subcontinent. In the streets of London, you are seeing some people wearing masks, face masks, but not very many. I don't think that it's quite captured the imagination that it has in other parts of Europe at the moment. But that's a very dangerous fallacy that we may be living. We think we're an island and that somehow we might be protected, but there's absolutely no reason to think we'll be protected, and it will definitely reach the shores of Great Britain at some point.
One of the issues that's come up is face masks in the United States. There was an article in the New York Times this Thursday, the fear that healthy people are hoarding them, like the ones produced in this factory in Thailand. Medical authorities warn there aren't enough for hospitals and those who are actually sick, like in Hong Kong, where there have been 10 cases so far. And here, filmed by our colleagues from AFP, are the images of people lining up to buy more of those face masks. Again, this Jean-Paul Chang, it's what André was describing earlier, how this sort of anxiety's gone global.
Maybe it's too early to say that it's going global. I mean, because the Chinese government deploys a huge actions to contain the spreading of the virus. Nobody can say that it will be successful or not. Right now, the number of victims are still growing, and the number of declared cases is growing as well. But the risk is, of course, a global pandemic or something like that.
Pandemic.
Pandemic progression. But nobody can be sure. So in the meantime, should we be hysterical about that? I'm not so sure. And listening to my neighbor...
we live in an age where news travels fast.
Yeah, but so far I believe that in China, okay, we got the time of rumors at the beginning. You have a lot of fake news rumors. But now, it's 6 days now after the New Year's, and people are accustomed to stay at home. And the mind, the general mind looks more calm, and people are not taking too seriously all these rumors, and you have the rumors about the shortage of masks, the rumor about the medical team dying, etc., etc. And actually, the government, the central one, and also now the local one, they are making an unprecedented effort of information and transparency. I just give the example of the press conference of the responsible of the Hubei province and the mayor of Wuhan. They've been cursed by journalists, publicly on the TV.
Yeah, they apologized in public. We're going to pick up on that point when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking at the coronavirus outbreak and the world reaction to it. Joining us from London, Richard Horton, who is editor at the science journal The Lancet. Welcome back as well to Jean-Paul Chang, China consultant, political commentator and founder of A Capital, André Lecruc-Pietri, and France 24's very own Julia Kim. Yeah, suspicions about the credibility of the information out of Beijing, tempered by awe at the ability of the Chinese to mobilize. State broadcaster CCTV sending this update on the building in under 2 weeks of not one but two makeshift hospitals that are due to open next Monday.
First, we were understaffed and we had to work 2 shifts, 12 hours a shift. Now, as more and more workers have come to help us from all over the country, we're working 3 shifts.
A lot of people have been talking about those 2 makeshift hospitals here.
I mean, I tell you, I think what we're seeing today is a battle of the systems. I think, I mean, we're talking obviously about an
because at first it was reported as they were building hospitals from scratch. They're not building them from scratch, right?
No. It's prefab, but I mean, I'm sure in the back of the head of the political leaders in China, how to make a good. I don't want to go into the typical cliche about crisis and opportunity, but this crisis might actually be an opportunity for the leaders to, number one, demonstrate their transparency. And I understand perfectly Mr. Horton when he says at the local level, but it's a fact that at the national level, the Chinese have understood that it makes no sense to hoard the information. Point number one.
Well, they didn't understand it until last Monday when the president weighed in.
Absolutely. And probably it's again one of these cases where actually the local level of the Communist Party, of the leaders, are worried about getting the information up because they are worried of getting punished or whatever. And the second thing is how to make to actually demonstrate that some kind of a control on the population on the railroads. You have an amazing and a lot of technology discussions right now. There are a lot of people talking about how the railways, the bus systems are actually sharing big data in order for everybody to know if he was in contact or not of somebody who had the symptoms, etc. So actually you're using artificial intelligence in order to track something which was impossible just 2 or 3 years ago. So I think it might be a way for the system to also demonstrate that this kind of organization can be extremely efficient in what is probably the biggest fear of the 21st century, which is a pandemic. Yeah.
Richard Horton, your thoughts?
I fully agree with those comments. The people we know in the National Health Commission in Beijing, that's their Ministry of Health, they're extremely sophisticated in their analysis and thinking. They know full well they have to be transparent with the information. They all have good contacts with the World Health Organization and the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta in the United States. They work all the time with these organizations and individuals there. So there's maximum collaboration. It's at the local level. So if you look in Wuhan, the very first case, as far as we know, was diagnosed on December the 1st. And then there was a period of 4 to 5 weeks where nothing happened. Basically, there was a total lockdown in information, a denial that there was any infection taking place. And it wasn't until, I think, January the 23rd or so, or early January, when Wuhan was actually locked down. So that period of 4 or 5 weeks allowed flights and high-speed rail links to transport literally millions of people from this major city of 11 million people around the country, seeding the infection in other Chinese cities and also internationally. So that was the difficulty, that people locally were so frightened to disclose any information. And that's the quid pro quo you have with a top-down system. Yes, you can do this amazing quarantine, this lockdown, and really have a very impressive public health response. But the cost is what you see at the local level, where people are frightened, not just for their jobs, but for their lives, in terms of what they say to the public or report centrally.
Richard, you say it works at the national level. We've heard grumblings here in Paris because the Pasteur Institute has dealings for a long time. There have been long-time relations with the city of Wuhan. They say they're not getting enough information. That's what some doctors are saying. What have you found?
Well, we're receiving information every day from the National Health Commission, from China's Centers for Disease Control, from the Chinese Academy of Medical Sciences, information about the evolution of the epidemic, information about the clinical course of the epidemic, information about the how rapidly the epidemic might be spreading, how infective the epidemic is. So we're getting a constant stream of information from Chinese scientists, literally on a day-by-day basis. So we're not seeing any unwillingness to share information. On the contrary, we're seeing this desperate urge to share information, to build confidence with the international community that China knows what it's doing. Because one of the things China doesn't want to happen is what's taking place right now, which is this meeting of the International Health Regulations Emergency Committee. They don't want a public health emergency of international concern declared against China, because that will suggest that China's not in control of the situation. But a fake is going to be declared. I'm 99.9% sure of it. And that's going to be a severe blow to Chinese credibility and their confidence about how they manage such an epidemic.
Of the meeting, the head of the World Health Organization apologizing for minimizing the threat, while at the same time praising China's mobilization in its effort to contain the outbreak.
I will praise China again and again, because its actions actually helped in reducing the spread of coronavirus to other countries.
So, of course, there are politics involved when you have an organization like the WHO. Jean-Paul Chang, you just heard Richard Horton say that for China, having this being declared a global emergency would only be the 6th time in history. It's a setback, a blow for the Chinese.
Of course. That's why they hope that it will not be declared, but there's no chance that will happen. So the thing is, politics are involved, but the present leadership in China, you always have to remember that when Xi Jinping and his team came to the power, their basic principle is to face crisis, whatever could be, financial crisis, sanitary crisis, political crisis, etc. And so they've been teaching all the members of the parties and the government to face crisis. So when you have the crisis situation, you are not surprised that they are reacting as they're doing at the national level, at least. And so somewhere I agree that they want to make a show that they are efficient in the mobilization to contain this virus, etc. But the key point is the internal politics in China. Okay, as far as the Chinese public opinion, the domestic opinion, stay calm and not panicking too much, and joining the effort of containing the virus, not only in Hubei, but now even in town like Beijing, even in some village around Beijing, people are taking automatically the kind of measure to control people coming out and getting out from the village, to take the temperature, etc. So as long as the population participates actively to this containment effort, I believe it's too early to talk politics. Nobody's thinking about politics right now. Maybe outside of China, yes, Mr. Pompeo saying that the biggest threat is the Chinese Communist Party. But in China, the virus is the biggest threat right now. So people don't care about politics still. So on the diplomatic front, even if the WHO declare the state of emergency, I don't believe that will change the behavior of the Chinese leadership. They are continue to show that they are able to control the situation.
Able to control the situation. And as you mentioned, Jean-Paul Chang, there's a dichotomy between how this crisis is being managed, its image domestically and the image abroad. And this crisis, as Julia Kim was telling us earlier, angering French nationals of Asian descent who've called out the casual racism they've endured, nowhere more than in Paris's Chinatown, where they've had to cancel the Lunar New Year parade, and where, well, the mood this Thursday was as glum as the weather when our team went out. Mario Sofos has more.
For this Asian supermarket, January is usually one of its busiest periods, as Paris's Chinese community prepares to celebrate the new year. However, this year, due to concerns over the spread of coronavirus, the festivities, including the customary parade, will not go ahead this weekend, much to the disappointment of the supermarket's owner.
This time last year, our sales increased by 15 to 20%, which we've not seen this year. Social media tends to exaggerate. In France, we are far from the epicenter of the virus.
Only 5 cases have been confirmed in France. However, the country's Asian community feels stigmatized.
People look at us strangely in the metro. I got a message from a friend. He entered a full metro train with a mask on, and everyone left.
I'm Vietnamese, but they think I'm Chinese, so in the metro, on the street, or in the neighborhood, they're going to avoid me.
In this district of Paris, coronavirus is at the forefront of many people's minds, but residents don't want to give in to hysteria.
We're in France. We're well protected.
It doesn't bother me, and if I want to go to an Asian restaurant, this wouldn't stop me.
Anything can happen, anywhere, and to anybody. We have to live normally. We've got to remain calm.
A call for calm and common sense echoed by a number of associations who are asking people to rebuke racism against Asian people via social media using the hashtag #IamNotAvirus.